knights without fear or reproach, dedicating their entire lives to serving their fair lady, wandering troubadours singing of true love, and refined relationships enveloped in the veil of romance and love. Is this how you imagine love in the Middle Ages? Well, it was all quite different. At that time, the church controlled everything and everyone, even the intricacies of intimate relations between husband and wife. Sex was allowed only for the purpose of procreation. A woman was called a lascivious sow, and the first wedding night was supposed to take place right before numerous witnesses. Could a feudal lord exercise his right to the first wedding night? What was the true nature of knights' love? Did they wear chastity belts? And is it true that it was in the Middle Ages that humanity invented love and marriage in our familiar understanding? An interesting detail, erotica in the medieval style was also quite different. Depictions of naked women were not considered erotic at the time, not at all. Naked bodies seemed genderless, and true symbols of sexuality were considered to be hair, lip color, face, and, of course, hands, which received much attention in grooming. After all, it was the hands that distinguished aristocratic women from peasants. So, let's meet our heroine, Catherine. And she lives in a strange time, the Middle Ages, in a small French town. Lately, she has been noticing a handsome neighbor youth who can't take his eyes off her. Finally, the young man confessed his love to her. She too was not indifferent to him, but she didn't know what to do. Who do you think the girl would go to for advice in the Middle Ages? No, not to her mother or a more experienced friend, but to the priest. Yes, you heard it right. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church poked its nose literally into all spheres of life, even excessively personal ones. So, the Middle Ages. The body was deemed sinful, much like women. She was considered the embodiment of sinfulness, and in numerous treatises of that time, she is described as filth and constantly open gates of hell. It was believed that a woman desires, and a man is obligated to keep her in check. Monks wrote these treatises, seemingly completely devoid of such experience and constantly trying to control their own passions. As a result, they created an image of a woman as an insatiable lascivious sow and a cruel she-wolf to be hated. Women evoked fear, distrust, and contempt. There was a popular view that she had no mind, she didn't know what she was doing. The church writer Jerome of Stridon strongly advises punishing and beating women. The ideal, of course, was virginity. But what about the continuation of the human race? The church came to a compromise. Sex was allowed only to spouses and only for the purpose of childbearing. And even then, God forbid, during the few church holidays. The church strictly monitored everything, right down to the recommended poses for spouses. All relationships between men and women regarding sensual love were called adultery. If it weren't for the church in the Middle Ages, Sigmund Freud would have been out of work. Adultery and fornication were even punished by death, but at the same time, the church often turned a blind eye to prostitution as a necessary evil. In general, as Johann Huizinga wrote, in the Middle Ages, the scent of roses was mixed with the smell of blood. But let's get back to our heroine. The lovesick youth René became increasingly persistent, but in response to his advances, the priest advised the girl to think about her immortal soul and avoid adultery. And then René proposed to her. It would seem, what else could a girl want in the Middle Ages? But was it worth getting married at that time? Here our Catherine seriously pondered. In the Middle Ages, the Lord, that is, the owner of the land on which you lived, had the right to spend the first night with the bride of his serf. It was even considered a favor. The young husband tried in every way to thank the Lord for such an honor with money or gifts. If the groom and bride did not want to adhere to traditions, then in some cases, they could buy off from the master if, of course, they had something to offer. Today, some historians consider the rite of the first night a popular myth that arose at a later time. However, here is a historical document that indeed confirms that such a rite existed in reality. The decision of the Arbitration Court of King Ferdinand to the Catholic from 1486, we consider and declare that lords also cannot, when a peasant gets married, sleep with his wife on the first night, and as a sign of their lordship on the wedding night, when the bride lies in bed, walk across the bed and over the aforementioned woman. Lords also cannot avail themselves against the will of the daughter or son of a peasant, for payment or without payment. And here is a document from 1507. If a subject enters into marriage and a wedding celebration is arranged, then the young spouse can spend the first night with his bride only if there is permission from the aforementioned lord above, or if the aforementioned lord has already slept with the bride. The French writer of the 19th century, Colin de Planzy, even wrote that it was officially permitted for canons, that is, clergy of the Cathedral of Saint Victor in Marseille, to exercise the rite of the first night with their serf girls. He also cites facts of lords selling the rite of the first night to other lords. However, if you were lucky enough and no lord spoiled your first night, then you have a medieval-style wedding ahead of you. I can tell you right away, it's not pleasant either. The first wedding night in the presence of numerous witnesses. Ascending to the marriage bed before witnesses was a wedding custom that persisted throughout the Middle Ages. In Scotland and England, guests didn't disperse until the bride undressed completely to confirm that she had no defects. For kings, however, things were even worse. To confirm that the marriage had taken place, up to 20 people were invited to the bridal bed, including the archbishop, witnesses, and even the groom's mother. And finally, when all is said and done, the marriage itself begins. By the way, there is a version that it was in the Middle Ages that marriage in our familiar understanding was invented. In the early Middle Ages, the concept of family as we know it did not exist in Europe. People, especially the nobility, lived in polygamous unions, changing wives one after another and seeing no problem in close kinship ties. In general, times were harsh and rough. At the same time, nobody heard of strict restrictions imposed by marriage. The Christian model of monogamous and indissoluble marriage emerged in Europe only in the 12th century, when the Church recognized marriage as one of the sacraments and began to protect it with all its might. Premarital and extramarital sexual relations were severely punished, sometimes by death or long repentance in church. But among the clergy, Jerome's definition remained popular: whoever loves his wife too passionately commits adultery. But under any circumstances, whether in marriage or outside it, in those times, women were completely powerless. Even in court, she cannot defend herself, and all the property she had at the time of marriage goes to her husband. The charter of the town of Villefranche in the 13th century allows every man to beat his wife on the condition that she does not die from the beatings. And what about divorce? Divorce in the Middle Ages was something out of fantasy. It wasn't accepted, and few would dare to do it because the procedure wasn't very pleasant. The only reasons for divorce were either the death of one of the spouses or the sexual dysfunction of the man. Well, to prove the inability of her husband, the wife had to invite priests and neighbors as experts, and then she had to sleep with him in their presence to demonstrate whether he could or not. In the presence of a crowd, usually, the man was declared impotent. Even worse were the circumstances in cases of adultery. Premarital or extramarital relationships were severely punished. In Italy, a man caught in adultery faced castration, while a woman who betrayed her husband lost her nose and was subjected to public flogging. In France, punishments varied in different provinces. In Paris, adultery was punished like a serious criminal offense, often with execution. In Orleans, adulterers were simply expelled from the city, while in Toulouse, a wife caught in adultery was confined to a monastery. But the most original punishment for this was in northern France. Those caught in adultery were made to run naked through the entire town. The adulteress ran ahead, holding a rope tied to her lover. The whole town would gather to witness such a spectacle. Rape was not uncommon. Girls rarely sought legal recourse at that time. Nevertheless, in one Italian judicial document from the 9th century, there is a story of a certain adelgisa who sued her rapist, the adelgar. He couldn't pay the required fine, so all his property became the property of the victim. If a wife cannot bear children, divorce is inevitable. But what if a man is unable to produce offspring? In the Middle Ages, they found original answers to this question. If a husband is incapable of impregnating his wife, the so-called marriage helper comes into play. The unfortunate husband had to gather neighbors and ask them to help his wife. He, of course, became the target of mockery, scorn, and gossip. Nevertheless, he was forced to participate in this process because if the woman went to the neighbor on her own initiative, it would be considered marital infidelity, punishable by death in some places. It might seem like an era unsuitable for lofty feelings. However, despite all this, it is precisely in the Middle Ages that humanity invents romantic love. Courtly, courteous, or polite love, one of the most significant achievements of European medieval culture. At a time when ladies were called lustful swine, suddenly, the service to a woman flourishes. In the late 11th century, several aristocrats and poets from southern France create a special world of feelings that create completely new relationships between men and women in Western civilization. Now it's not just about fighting neighbors and wiping your hands on a napkin. In addition to tournaments and wars, a knight is entitled to love conquests. And to become famous, he must conquer the lady he likes. Unexpectedly. Just yesterday, ordinary uncouth bandits and rogues start carrying handkerchiefs, begin washing themselves, don elegant costumes, and practice the art of singing and dancing to win favor. Yes, now the dominant position in love belongs to women. A knight must love his married lady with all his heart and know that there will never be any other relationships between them. Such is the romantic, platonic love spread throughout Europe thanks to troubadours and knightly romances, including its most remote corners. By the way, it was then that the heart first became a symbol of love. The main rules of true courtly love are outlined in the Code of Love by Andreas Capellanus. The main law in it, marriage is not an obstacle to love. Moreover, during one of the courts of love, ladies decreed, true love is impossible in marriage, because marriage is coercion. There were other laws as well. Love that became known does not last long. Easily won love is often little valued, but love won with difficulty is exalted. Or this, receiving something from a loving person against their will never leads to good. These rules formed the basis of yet another specific medieval invention, love courts at the courts of kings, where it was the ladies who judged and pronounced sentences. Historian Henri Martin believes that the courts of love in the Middle Ages were organized uniquely. Love, equated to science and religion, had its own code of laws, its, so to speak, canonical law. And women's tribunals attempted to apply this law just as the church applied its own. Let's return to our Catherine. One fine day, a priest supporting her in her struggle against temptations informed her that he would have to leave for Venice on urgent business. But he instructed our heroine to swear that in his absence, she would not succumb to her weakness. She promised to be steadfast, but on the condition that the priest bring her a mirror. Venice was renowned for its mirrors, and she longed to see her beautiful face in one. What did husbands do in the Middle Ages when they were leaving and didn't quite trust their wives? Install surveillance cameras? No. They bought chastity belts and literally locked up the ladies. This is one of the most piquant stories of the Middle Ages. There were many cases where the husband left home for a long time, and meanwhile, the wife became pregnant. In such cases, the belt had to be removed with the help of master blacksmiths, witnesses, and representatives of the church. These belts can be found in many European museums. But from a medical point of view, wearing them is questionable. From the heavy metal, there would have been abrasions and wounds that, if infected, would have led to fatal blood poisoning. But what about chastity belts that are exhibited in many museums in Europe? Well, modern historians are confident that these are actually forgeries from the Victorian era. A major scandal erupted in the 1990s when employees of the largest medieval museums, the British and Parisian museums, conducted an examination and found that supposedly medieval artifacts were made in the mid-19th century. Now the British Museum catalogue says most of the items now known were made in the 18th and 19th centuries as fetishes for the obsessed or as a joke. Serious museums rushed to remove questionable artifacts into storage. And our lovely Catherine, despite her romantic feelings for her Renee, managed to resist all temptations without a chastity belt. She so desperately wanted to receive a Venetian mirror. Finally, when the priest returned, she proudly told him that she managed to avoid the weakness of the flesh, even though the young man was insistent and showered her with gifts. The priest remained silent. And then Catherine couldn't resist and asked him about the mirror. How horrified she was when she saw what he had brought her. So, the church categorically did not approve of sex. It was considered something shameful, repeating the original sin. You might ask, well, what about husband and wife then? Here's how. A spiritual union, the example of which was given in the 6th century by Bishop Gregory the Great. One young couple lived together all their lives, sharing the same bed and preserving an innocence worthy of praise. But at this rate, humanity would simply have died out. Here's some guidance from the Catholic Church. Of course, all of this was allowed only for the sake of conceiving a child. Embraces were permitted. But confession before and after intercourse was recommended. Unsuccessful attempts to conceive a child were considered a real sin. Although women suffered much more for these sins than men did. Talking about sex was only allowed in confession. Archbishop Theodore of Canterbury, who lived in the 7th century, forbade husbands from seeing their wives naked. The church also had a clear stance on homosexual relationships. It was considered unnatural and forbidden, and violators were subjected to strict punishment and deprived of their lives. In the 12th century, they were burned, subjected to various tortures to drive out demons and atone for sins. Nevertheless, there is evidence that royal figures and representatives of the nobility often engaged in homosexual relationships. For example, it is suspected that the famous King Richard the Lionheart was involved with his brother at the time of his marriage to his chosen bride. In any medieval city, there was a brothel. At that time, they were mostly called women's houses. Their necessity was not disputed by anyone, including the church. After all, they were intended not only to protect decent girls and women, but also to supervise immorality. And how do you imagine a medieval convent for women? Quiet, nuns praying in cold cathedrals? But no. In the Middle Ages, there were special variants of monasteries, no different from houses of tolerance. Thus, the church tried to control and regulate prostitution. For example, the monastery in Avignon in southern France was founded in the 14th century to combat prostitution. They gathered all the women of easy virtue, not to reform them, but for them to provide their services under the church's control. They were locked up round the clock, and the monastery's doors were opened only at the discretion of the abbess. She selected clients at her discretion, and visitors were strictly warned not to misbehave, not to harass the easy nuns. At the slightest pretext for complaint, a client could be seized and thrown into the tower. But the most important directive stated that the women of the monastery had to undergo examination by the abbess and a doctor every Saturday. Moreover, such a house of tolerance was indeed called a monastery. It was under the patronage of the Order of St. Mary Magdalene. And what about our heroine? We left her at the moment when the priest extracted an object from the folds of his robe, shocking her. It was a skull. He cynically held it up to the young woman's face and said, "Here, vain woman, here is your true appearance. Think about it, for you will have to die, and before God, you are nothing." Catherine shuddered with horror and that very night gave herself to her beloved. From then on, she enjoyed his company, indulging in the joys of love. This is the true medieval story that we have simply retold to you.